Right.
We had a volunteer who was supposed to welcome you, they forgot
Oh,
who they were.
Okay, hi. Can we go around the room and have everybody tell me who you are? I don't think there's anybody I know here. So, could you just say your name and give me a little bit of background on what you do, what your interests are, something so I know who it is.
Either way, I can.
Okay.
Jameson Rudd. I'm a first-year MTS student. My background's in youth ministry, so my goal is to kind of apply this stuff to kind of nonprofit work with youth.
Okay, great.
Nomai Boku. I come from Myanmar, and I'm now in MD second year.
Great.
I'm Trey, original from Congo/Wisconsin.
Congo/Wisconsin?
Yes.
Strange place.
Yeah. My background,
Where in Congo?
University Kinshasa.
No, from Kinshasa.
Yeah.
No, it's from Kinshasa. Where's your family?
My family right now.
No, where are their roots from? What was your maternal language?
In Waka, it's from Ecuador. I never been there. Yeah. So my background,
Oye, bilinga. Okay.
My background is in IT. I'm a first year and that, so yeah.
My name is Amy Ty, I'm a third year, I think, and I'm interested in environmental justice in a new way. Sort of the old models don't seem to work. And I'd love to be an eco-chaplain.
My name is Paul Demers. I'm here for the fun of it. I've already paid my dues. I'm a teacher at Rivier University. Do a course on reconciliation in the world of conflict, so this fits right in. And I'm here to plagiarize books and techniques from different teachers and enjoy them.
Hello, my name is Min. My last name is KWN Guang. So I'm from South Korea. I'm a STEM student first semester.
Charles Daniels, third year MDiv, interest in forgiveness and reconciliation.
My name is Brianne, I'm a first year MDiv, and I don't really know yet.
My name is Danielle Keller. I'm an MDiv third year, but I'm doing it over 5 years, so it's my midway. And I'm interested in justice work. I come from Maine, and there's a lot of stuff going on right now with the automatic law track, so
Hence the class with Drew.
yes.
I'm Roger. I'm in my last semester of the MDiv. I'm planning on being an Army chaplain sometime next year.
Hi, I'm Joy. I'm from Greece, and this is my last semester MTS. And I think I will go and work with a refugee camp back in Greece.
I'm Calvin. I'm a first year MDiv. I'm on the chaplaincy track, hoping to do hospital chaplaincy or prison chaplaincy.
Okay.
And I'm Lisa, in my first year MDiv and pastoral track. And you always need to know how to deal with reconciliation.
I'm Sam. I'm a first year MTS MSW dual degree. I'm interested in reconciliation in both community and family contexts.
Okay.
I'm Maddie. I'm a first year soon to be MTS student, switching programs, and my background is in education and math.
And back in the car.
I'm not a student, I'm here to record the course though.
Well, welcome. Eat your lunch in peace. Great. So what's the difference between MDiv and MTS?
A year.
Content-wise, there's...
In my denomination, I'm United Methodist, and so is the school. But people come from all different backgrounds. But at least in my denomination, you get an MDiv so you can become like an ordained elder and be a pastor. And then MTS is more for like doctoral study. And like education, that kind of thing. So.
Okay. Great. All right, so Yes, tell me about it. We're just did introductions. so-
Sorry, my name's Andrea.
Okay. And you're MDiv student?
No, I'm a pastor scholar.
Okay, great. So I looked over the syllabus. I guess you've read most of this by this point. Sorry to flip that on you, but I'm happy to talk about whatever you like. I originally had sort of said I thought you were just, I know for today you were reading sort of the second half, looking at the sort of local cases. Let me give you a little bit of background on sort of where the project came from. Let me also frame it in terms of, I am by nature a sort of very positive, optimistic kind of person, which does not come through in something like this. One of the problems, I'm a social scientist, and we are really good at explaining why things don't work, and we're really bad at explaining how things could work. It is much easier to look at what is and say why it's wrong than it is to look at what could be and say what it should be. So, this is sort of one of those reflections. I actually wish I could be more positive. The countries that I have studied have tended to be places that have a lot of problems. And I do think there are some positive models. The book that I'm working on now is looking at trying to explain why some Christian churches in Africa are combating with the state, why they are in conflict with the state, while in other places like Rwanda, they're very closely tied to the state and compromised, trying to understand sort of that process. What is it? Because the same missionary societies brought the Anglican Church, for example, to Kenya and Tanzania and Rwanda and Congo, but the Anglican Church is very different in each of those countries. In Kenya, it's been fairly outspoken. In Rwanda, it's been very much compromised and tied to the state. So what I'm working on now is to try to come up a little more positively and sort of think about what is it that gets churches. And I'm particularly interested in cases like in Tanzania, where the churches have been not very political at all. They've tended to be mildly supportive of the state, but just not very politically engaged. But the government in Tanzania over the past several years has become increasingly authoritarian. Tanzania has never been a really thriving democracy. They've always had the same party that's been in charge, but they have had regular alternation of presidents. They've gone back and forth between a Christian and a Muslim president every time. Each of them serves for just 2 terms, and they do allow opposition parties, and they've had a pretty free press and a free civil society, although it hasn't been very vibrant. But over the past 5 years, the president who's been elected has been putting into place laws that restrict civil society, that restrict press freedom. Opposition candidates have been increasingly harassed and arrested. And all of a sudden, the churches have begun to speak up. Catholics, Lutherans, which is the main Protestant denomination, and even some Pentecostals have been speaking very loudly, criticizing the government for its authoritarian drift. And so I'm interested in that process. It doesn't get reflected in the book like this, right? But one of the things we do as social scientists is you ask an interesting question, and then you let the data answer the question. So the seed of this project, let me just give you sort of my background. So I went to Rwanda first in 1992, before the genocide. I was originally supposed to go to Congo, so I studied Lingala, and I had my research clearance, and I was going to work with the Disciples of Christ community in Equateur and look at religious engagement in politics in Congo. 2 weeks before I was supposed to leave, in September of 1991, there was troop rioting throughout the country, and it targeted foreign nationals. So most of the missionaries fled at that time. A lot of other Westerners fled, and I was told I really couldn't go to Congo. And so I kind of sat around for a little while and tried to figure out where else I could go, what I could do to see if things were going to calm down in Congo. And things didn't. Finally, one of my dissertation committee members said, well, why don't you go to Rwanda? It's a nice, peaceful little country. So I shifted to Rwanda, got there, found out that there was a civil war already ongoing that I really wasn't aware of. And spent a year in Rwanda watching the country move towards genocide. When I got there in early 1992, it was a very optimistic time, very positive, because there had been a lot of public protests that had forced the government to legalize opposition parties. Under further pressure, the government created a multi-party government with a prime minister from the opposition, and so it really seemed like the country was on the verge of being able to bring down a dictator. And then over the course of the next year, there were ethnic attacks that took place. The country became increasingly divided and polarized, and I wouldn't have necessarily predicted genocide when I left. I left about 11 months before the genocide, but I did predict that things were going in a very bad direction and that violence was imminent. I thought it would have been more political violence than ethnic, but that sort of happened in a way that you know, watching that process of a country move from great political optimism to a position where they're on the verge of genocide is something that shapes a lot of how I look at the world. After I finished my dissertation, which I was writing while the genocide took place, I was asked by Human Rights Watch to go back to Rwanda. Not because I knew anything about human rights. I actually had not taken any courses, studied anything about international law or rights or anything of that sort, but because I knew about Rwanda and I spoke some Kinyarwanda, and so I went to Rwanda, became the head of the Human Rights Watch office there that was doing research on how the genocide happened, and then now I teach courses on human rights and transitional justice and things of that sort because I learned on the job. I had to actually read all the international law that was related to the reports that I was writing, and while I was there, I also did some work on ethnic violence that was taking place in Congo as people were fleeing into Rwanda, and worked on that, wrote my first book, Christianity and Genocide in Rwanda, looking at the role of Christian churches in the genocide. It's just, again, a very pessimistic book. But actually what I talk about in there is the divisions within the churches themselves, and the degree to which the church's engagement in the genocide can be explained in part through church politics, because there was actually a strong movement for democracy in the Christian churches. There was a strong movement for progressive change. There were women who were demanding greater voice and empowerment within the churches. There were a lot of lay people. There were several major lay movements that were taking place within the Catholic Church. It manifested itself in part in a movement around visions related to visions of the Virgin Mary. There were schoolgirls who were said to be possessed of Mary and spoke for her. There was a whole popular movement that rose up that the bishops did not like at all, but that was a way for sort of people to empower themselves, and it was significant that half of the people who had these visions were themselves from the minority ethnic group, the Tutsi. Within the churches, there was ethnic politics that was played. Hutu, after the revolution of 1959, in which Hutu took power of the country, Tutsi were put into marginalized positions. They couldn't get government jobs, so a lot of them ended up in the priesthood or as Protestant pastors, but they couldn't get promoted within the church. All the bishops were from the majority ethnic group, all of the leaders of all of the church organizations, and so there was ethnic politics going on. And so what I ultimately argue is you had people within the church who were influenced by liberation theology, both Protestant and Catholic, actually more Protestants than Catholics. You had people who were influenced by progressive ideas about lay involvement and changing the culture of the church and democratizing the church, and they were pushing for change. And in part, the support of the hierarchy for the genocide was a reaction against that, because it allowed them to, at least they thought it would allow them to wipe out these people who were challenging their power within the church. And so that's kind of what I witnessed over a period of years in Rwanda. When I went back to Rwanda for Human Rights Watch, I did a lot of, I was able to follow up with the local parishes that I had studied, and was able to talk to genocide survivors and others about what had happened in their communities, and found there were people that I had known pretty well in the period before the genocide who were themselves involved in organizing the killings. I had a friend who was raped by someone that I knew very well when she was basically held as a sex slave for a month before someone sort of ferreted her away and hid her for the rest of the period. And I have people that I knew pretty well, people whose homes I ate in, who murdered other friends that I knew. And so If my writing is sometimes a little bit dark, that's because the reality I'm looking at is sometimes dark. I work a lot comparatively. Most of my writings are on Rwanda, but I've actually spent a lot of time in Congo and in Burundi and in Kenya and Tanzania and in South Africa, and spent some time in Senegal and Sierra Leone and a variety of other places in Africa. So this is situated somewhat within that. After I did my initial work on the churches in Rwanda, I was starting a project looking comparatively at religion and politics, but University of California, Berkeley had gotten $500,000 from the MacArthur Foundation to do research on post-conflict Rwanda and former Yugoslavia, and I got asked to come and direct the research project for them. The project was organized by a guy named Eric Stover, who you know from this. So Eric's background was as the head of Physicians for Human Rights, which was based here in Cambridge. He, as head of that organization, had been one of the people who pushed most strongly for the creation of the international criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Physicians for Human Rights gets medical personnel involved in human rights work, and in particular, as opposed to Physicians for Social Justice, which focuses more on sort of doctors just supporting human rights. This is actually getting them involved in human rights research. So Physicians for Human Rights was in charge of the interments, the disinterments of several mass graves in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. The point of digging up a mass grave is it allows you to see who is actually buried in the mass graves. And what they find, of course, is that the majority are women and children and the elderly, which proves that it's not just deaths from a civil war, right? So if you can show that children are being killed by machete, then the people who want to claim that this was a civil war are shown to be lying. And that was necessary in order to take it to the United Nations to get them to say, okay, these were genocides. We have evidence that this was genocide. And so Physicians for Human Rights was one of the groups that was really behind pushing for the creation of the tribunals. But almost a decade in, people like Eric were sort of worried that the tribunals were not having the impact that they had hoped they would have. And so the seed that drove this project, out of which this book came, as well as the My Neighbor, My Enemy book, was this question of whether the international criminal tribunals were making any difference in the countries that they were addressing. People who'd written on the tribunals were focusing on their contributions to international law. But the problem that Eric was confronted with was, as somebody who'd been working with medical doctors doing research on human rights violations, it's very empirically driven. And the issue that he was troubled by was the lack of empirical support that transitional justice actually did anything good. A lot of the work that pushed for the creation of the ICTJ and the ICTR, that pushed ultimately for the creation of the International Criminal Court, was based on basically legal theory. There's a lot of lawyers who argued this is what we need to promote rule of law. In order to stop impunity and to create a just legal order, to get people to stop engaging in genocide and ethnic violence and authoritarianism, we need to have trials that hold people accountable, because that will, then there's a long list of things that supposedly it does. It establishes rule of law, helps the survivors come to terms with what happened, and therefore promotes reconciliation. It's a long sort of set of ideas. The problem that Eric was troubled by was that there's no empirical proof for any of that. Like we're investing a lot in creating courts, but there's no evidence that they actually are doing anything to promote peace. Yeah.
What would be an example of that? Like,
Well-
what would be empirical?
So ideally, let's say, a good scientific way to do it would be you go into Yugoslavia when the war is starting, before the ICTJ is created, ICTY, and test attitudes. That do surveys that test attitudes. You have the tribunal come back at the end of the tribunal and test attitudes again and see if they've changed.
got it.
Right? So that could be sort of empirical proof. So you say that these trials are going to help reconcile Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats. All right, let's test it. Right. So that's actually the My Neighbor, My Enemy is an attempt to start to do that through survey research. Unfortunately, it's most of it is one point in time, so it's not looking at things chronologically. The one advantage I had with this was I was looking at it before Gacaca was created, while Gacaca was in operation, and then I was able to go back and do interviews after Gacaca and so follow up. So a lot of what drove the project overall was this question of is transitional justice making things better or not? Yeah.
So, just a random comment, you're holding it, I don't know if I can go below. One of the questions I wanted to ask is, that's one pathway of looking at something, but if you have a larger paradigm that isn't necessarily legal, it's theological or spiritual, again, does that change the structure of how you do your research and what your expectations are for the outcomes?
Well, so transitional justice, I mean, as you all are exploring, right? It's a really loose term that's being used to apply to a lot of things, and there are a lot of promises being made about what it can accomplish. Those promises go way beyond the legal realm. So part of the problem that we had is that you have lawyers making claims based on no empirical evidence about how this is going to help survivors feel better, which is probably something that psychiatrists and psychologists and others can be better at assessing. There are comments on how it is going to heal the communities, which is maybe something that sociologists or theologians or others are better at judging. The problem is that we've come to say, okay, trials aren't just about justice, they're about all of these other things. And so there are these big promises being made, and what this project started in 2001, actually it started in 2000, I came on in 2001. And it was really driven by these questions. Can we explore this? Let's take these two cases where the international community is investing a lot in creating these big international tribunals, and let's see, are they making things any better in the countries affected? So particularly Bosnia, but Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, and Rwanda. And to answer that, part of the realization is we can't just look at the legal, right? You can't just look at courts and their impact, because they're part of a broader context. And so we looked, we looked more broadly at how the societies were changing. The language that was used in My Neighbor, My Enemy for the overall project was to talk about social reconstruction as opposed to reconciliation, because the people in the former Yugoslavia very much resisted the concept of reconciliation because they thought it was a concept, particularly from Christianity, that was being imposed on these countries, and there was a sense that it didn't resonate with their languages, it didn't resonate with their culture, and that it was very much a Western, it was something from outsiders that was being imposed on them. In Rwanda, people didn't have trouble with the word reconciliation. As I talk about in here, there was a Rwandan word that has a similar meaning, or at least it's close enough that it could resonate. But at any rate, in the project overall, we look at social reconstruction, and so we're interested in this sort of broader project. We got additional funding from the Hewlett Foundation to look at schools in both countries and see their role in reconciliation. We were interested in opinion surveys of people's attitudes, as well as sort of looking at grassroots communities and thinking about how people are coming together. We did a survey as part of our project where we really were trying to understand things like, we sort of measured, what are things that would show that you're not just living together peacefully, but that there are some connections between you, right? So have you been to a funeral from somebody from another ethnic group in the past year? Have you shared a drink with someone from another ethnic group? Have you exchanged livestock, which is those kinds of things. So we had questions about that. So the whole point was actually get at this sort of idea that it's not just about the courts and sort of measuring the courts, but thinking more broadly about how does justice fit into this broader project. So that's kind of what drove this, and that's the research. So from 2001 to 2005, I ran 7 different research projects related to this project. One was a study of Gacaca that a group of Rwandan scholars headed. Another was a study of civil society. I was most directly involved in this sort of ethnographic research of 3 local communities. We did a survey where we had an epidemiologist, a lawyer, and a psychiatrist, and me, all working on the survey together, a mix of Rwandans and non-Rwandans, and then just sort of asking these questions like, what do Rwandans think about justice? How does the International Criminal Tribunal fit into it? How do other trials fit into it? You know, and because it was an extended project, things were changing on the ground while we were doing it, right? So Gacaca in particular, when we started the project, had not yet begun. They started the first phase while we were in the process of doing our main research. And then before we finished up the project, they launched Gacaca fully. And then I, 10 years later, had a research assistant who worked on the earlier project go back and follow up in the communities where we'd been before, to just sort of see what's happened 10 years on. So Gacaca's been over for a couple of years, and he was able to go back and talk to some of the same people, but also just people from the same communities about their experiences to talk about that. All right, so that's kind of where the project came from. It was a lot of different things feeding into it. It took me a long time to write it, in part because there was so much being written on Rwanda at the time. Sort of every time you felt you were done, there's 5 other books you had to read, because you have to include everything. What do you want me to talk about, or what questions you have, or comments, or
We do have
ideas?
questions.
Questions, great.
Well, one thing, to sort of make a point that somehow it didn't work, but is it because the way there were so many exceptions to Gacaca, for example, to some groups that were not subject to, to the law, to the tribal. So that seems to be it's the way the system was handled rather than the system itself. You get my point?
I actually, I was very optimistic about Gacaca.
Yeah.
Before, right? So I wrote a piece in like 2003, I think, where I was really quite hopeful. And what I said in that piece is, if the government allows it to function as a grassroots program that's left independent, that it could have a very positive change. But my worry was that it would become politicized.
And
They
protected themselves.
And that is exactly what happened. I mean, it became. Well, it's interesting. So there's a couple of things. So one issue is that it only dealt with the genocide. Okay, that it didn't include the RPF crimes. But even setting that issue aside, to say that the government protected itself, it didn't allow discussion of crimes by those who are in power now. There were problems with how Gacaca functioned because it was politicized in other ways. Right. So. Even if you had not dealt with RPF crimes, but true justice had been applied for the crimes that were dealt with, right? So if you had actually had a fair adjudication of those who were involved in the genocide based upon real facts and open discussion, that still could have been a positive outcome. The problem was that there certainly were people who were involved in the genocide whose cases were discussed and evidence presented, and they were found guilty and they were punished. But there were a lot of other people who were guilty and did not get punished because their families were powerful and they were able to protect themselves. There were a lot of people who were accused and unable to defend themselves sufficiently and were found guilty and punished even though they were not guilty. I had a conversation with a couple of survivor friends back in 1990, must have been about 96, where we were sort of thinking about how many people were involved in the genocide. We're estimating, there's a lot of distortion of facts, right? So this claim that 1 million people were killed in the genocide. The number of Tutsi in Rwanda at the time was itself maybe just 1 million. This country's 7.5 million at the time of the genocide, and somewhere between 10% and 15% were Tutsi. According to the census, it's 9%, but it was probably higher than that because people had some incentive to not admit that they were Tutsi. But if you figure that the Tutsi population is 10%, that would leave you 750,000. If it's a genocide where you're targeting Tutsi, there can't be 1 million killed because that would mean that 250, what are the other 250,000 people? Right? So the numbers were just destroyed. There's this whole game of claiming that more people died than did. Just as an aside, someone in Rwanda recently did a study of mass graves in Rwanda that found that in the mass graves, according to their accounting, there are 2.5 million people in the mass graves. So guess what? The majority of people in the mass graves for genocide memorials were not killed in the genocide. Right? At any rate, so
I'm sorry, say that last piece again?
2.5 million bodies are now buried in mass genocide graves.
That's been verified. Are you saying that's a verifiable?
That's, yeah. So there was a Rwandan newspaper that did a study of how many bodies are buried in each of the genocide sites. Added them up, it adds up to 2.5 million.
But verified, not just estimated, not sort of.
Well, no, it is an estimate. I mean, it's basic. But it's saying this is the claims that are being put forward, that they're saying. So for example, the number of, if you go to the website for the Rwandan Memorial, the Genocide Memorial Museum in Kigali, they list, I think, 350,000 bodies that they have. The population of Kigali was 250,000 at the time. And the majority of those were Hutu. So if they have 350,000 bodies, they cannot be from Tutsi killed in the genocide in Kigali. Simply can't, because there weren't that many Tutsi in Kigali. And if you add up all the numbers from all the different sites around the country, you get 2.5 million. You know, even their claims are that only 1 million people were killed in the genocide. Right? So something's going on with these sorts of things. So my point is, get back to the question about sort of the trials. Is you had people who were guilty who weren't held accountable. You had a lot of people who were not guilty. So this friend and I were talking about how many people were killed. Sorry, that was like, and we estimated how many people were involved in the killing. We said at most 80,000 to 100,000 were directly involved in killings. The vast majority of people were killed by the small death squads in the large massacres. And then there were follow-up killings in which you chased down survivors, but even in those, the majority of people, most people weren't involved in those. And so the fact that you had over 1 million people who had to defend themselves for accusations, right? It's 1.1 million. Well, if the population is 7.5 million, and you have 500,000 Tutsi who were killed, that leaves you, 7 million, right? Half of those are under the age of culpability, so that's 3.5 million. Half of those are women who generally weren't held accountable, so it's 1.75 million. So just on basis, not even counting the number of people who died in the meantime, if you have 1.1 million Hutu who were tried under genocide charges, that means you were trying a large majority of the potential population. Right? The vast majority of cases in Gacaca were property crimes, where you didn't have a right to appeal, and where because the sentence is so small, it's not really worth defending yourself in some ways. It was easier just to be found guilty and do a little community service in exchange. But the result is that on all sides there was a sense that Gacaca did not bring justice. So the question is why? Could it have been better? Yeah, I mean, it could have if the government had allowed it to function. Why didn't the government allow it to function? That's ultimately what I'm arguing in the book, because when you have a highly authoritarian state, the tools of transitional justice that might work in a state that is more democratic and more open are abused, right? So we look at the way elections work in countries around the world. You can say a similar thing. That elections, we would say in general, are a good thing. Most of us think it's good for people to be able to choose their governments. But most dictatorships around the world hold elections. Rwanda holds elections in which the president wins 98% of the vote. Right? And then they use that to say, look, everyone loves our president. Somebody interviewed me on NPR, and I was being critical of the regime. They said, well, with all these criticisms, why do Rwandans love the president so much? And I said, well, what's your evidence for that? Well, he won 98% of the vote. Yeah, that's not actually evidence that people love him. That's evidence that people are terrified of him. And so my ultimate conclusion is, yeah, it's not to say that transitional justice isn't useful. I mean, you couldn't have something like Gacaca that could work. I actually think the idea of bringing justice to the people, letting people engage in it themselves, is actually a really good idea. I like that idea. It's just I don't think it can work in a state that's this authoritarian. What you see in a place like Chile or Argentina was that there was something of a dialectic that took place. place, where you had the courts doing a little something, and then the political system would become a little more democratic in some ways, which would open up things for the courts to move a little further, right? So you started with the Reddick Report, which was a truth commission, but it was very different than the South African Truth Commission, in that it didn't name names. All it did was document the people who were killed by the government, without implicating anyone. But the fact that you actually had a government commission that documented that over 3,000 people were killed by the state was important, and that opened things up to allow the courts to be a little more bold, and then you had some changes in the political, so this kind of back and forth where the transitional justice worked together with democratization, and they were sort of mutually reinforcing. In the Rwanda case, you had a very authoritarian state that implemented transitional justice initiatives from on high to serve its own purposes. So I don't think it's an overall comment about transitional justice so much as this idea that transitional justice is in and of itself a panacea is problematic.
Based on that, what changes would you like to see in the reconstruction efforts in Rwanda? Besides it being an actual grassroots courts, is that the only
No,
piece?
so I don't think transitional justice can work in Rwanda without democracy. So I am actually a big believer in democracy because I'm not a big believer in governments. In the United States, the approach of the left has been one that has tended to embrace an activist government. That the way that we make progressive changes in our society is through an activist government. Grows out of the civil rights movement, makes a lot of sense. You had regions of the country that were very resistant to positive change, and the only way that you could overcome that resistance was by having an activist state from on high sort of implement things. But I actually think that those of us who think of ourselves as progressives have failed to realize the power of empowering people from below. I think maybe we're getting there now. But so when you hear Ruth Bader Ginsburg talk about the history of Roe v. Wade, there was, while she supported the idea of Roe, and she, if you know her history, she was one of the people who was actually involved in some of the early activism around this, but regrets the way that it happened because it ended up being something that, as opposed to coming more from the bottom, it ended up being imposed from the top, and therefore you developed a lot of resistance. And so, while realizing that there was a need to have an official decision that guaranteed the right to abortion, her argument and reflection is it would have been better if we'd actually waited a few years until we had more of a groundswell of support and more states legalized abortion themselves, and you got more of a grassroots movement, and it became clear that this was not going to destroy all of society. And then you could have the Supreme Court say, yeah, in those states that are outliers that are still out there, let's bring them on board. I think that I actually believe in a country like Rwanda, democracy had a lot of potential, particularly immediately after the RPF took power. The people who were most involved in the genocide were not in Rwanda. They had all left. The people who stayed were people who stayed for a reason. And most of them stayed because they hadn't supported the genocide, they hadn't supported the government that carried out the genocide, and they were optimistic the RPF, which said it was going to implement the Arusha Accords and have a multi-party government, that it would actually create the society it was promising to create. And I think it could have. I mean, I was there at that time. I was there before the invasion before the refugees were sent back from Tanzania, and then before the invasion of Congo sent 1 million people back into Rwanda from Congo. And many of those people were involved in the genocide directly and were the leaders who had carried it out. But I actually think at that time you could have created a democratic system in which the moderate Hutu as well as the Tutsi tied to the RPF could have the government didn't need to be as suspicious of its population as it was. What I hope comes through, and one of the things I grappled with was trying to understand the mentality of those who were in power today, and realizing that they weren't in Rwanda in 1994. If they were attacking, they were the soldiers. But the people who run Rwanda today don't actually know anything about the genocide. Right? What they know is people of their ethnicity were killed, and they came in and they found dead bodies and they found mass graves, and so the idea they have about the genocide is that it was a popular genocide, that everybody in the country hated the Tutsi, that it was driven by hatred, it was driven by ideology. And the research we've done on the genocide since has suggested that that's wrong in a lot of ways. One is the number of people who are actually involved in killing is much lower than those in power think. Number two is that the motivations of those who were involved in the killing are very different, and they weren't driven mostly by ideology. They were driven by fear, they were driven by social connections. There were a lot of other things that got people to kill. People didn't mostly kill because they hated Tutsi. They killed because their government officials were telling them they needed to do this to defend themselves, and all the information that they were being told was that the RPF was killing all Hutu it came into contact with, and that these Tutsi were agents of the RPF, and if you don't participate in the killing, you and your family may be killed, because look, we killed a couple of your neighbors who were objecting to the genocide, and beyond that, if you do the killing and you participate, you may get the cattle and the possessions of the people that you kill, and beyond that, you're a young person, and the elders are letting you stand up and have some power in a way that you're never allowed in this society. There's a lot of things that went into it. Those in power don't understand that. And so what's happened is you have a government that is very afraid of its own people and does not trust them. And therefore they have resisted democracy. And guess what's happened around the world is everybody said, there was a genocide there, they can't have democracy. So the American government, the British government, which have been the primary funders of Rwanda, have been very accepting of authoritarianism there, because it's what we think. I mean, to be frank, it's what we tend to think Africans need in general, because there's a general sense that goes back to the racism that allowed colonialism, that Africans aren't really capable of democracy. There's a general sense that Africans are so backward and undeveloped that what they really need is benign dictatorship. And so we've been very tolerant of benign dictators there because our policy is driven by racism. And there's no recognition, of course, that the extraction of resources and that the chaos that we help to sow in the countries of Africa benefits us. That our cell phones are cheap in part because they have conflict minerals in them. That those minerals are cheap because of the chaos that exists in Eastern Congo, for example. So my solution is actually to be more democratic. I have a lot of faith in the Rwandan people, and I think if you got the government out of the way, that the people would solve their own problems.
So the things that you're saying there is related to a question that I have, which is, is there any hope? Is there any hope for international bodies to engage with these post-conflict situations in a way that doesn't just recreate the atrocities of colonialism, or
So
yeah.
So the problem with almost all of the implementations of transitional justice in post-conflict settings, particularly when the international community is involved, is that they tend to be very top-down. There is a sense that you can't do research in post-conflict societies. You either don't have the time, or you're not able to actually go in and do solid research. Right? And so there's a tendency to have conflict settlements to be all elite bargains. So within political science, we talk about consociationalism, which is where you bring the parties in a conflict together and come up with some agreement that makes each of them have some stake in that. So the classic case with Lebanon. So in Lebanon, the president is from, I forget which is which, but the president of the three key positions, the president, the prime minister, and the speaker of the assembly, one is a Maronite Christian, one is a Druze Muslim, and one is a Shia Muslim, right? And so each of the groups is represented, and every group feels, and this is an agreement that's reached at the top through negotiations. And that's almost always how these international efforts on transitional justice are done. They're Western ideas, largely coming from lawyers and legal scholars, about what the country needs. And what the international community should do is to actually go and ask the people what they think they need. You can go into countries and say, what needs to happen in this country for you to feel whole again? Now, you're going to ask the president that, he or she is not going to give you an answer that actually reflects the popular will. governments generally do a pretty bad job of reflecting their populations. You know, let's look at the United States. We're a relatively democratic country. And you look at our representatives, you would assume that we are a country made up of extraordinarily wealthy old white men, because that's who our politicians are. Now, do those extraordinarily wealthy old white men actually have any idea what it's like to be a normal person in the US, to live in the countryside? They don't. And yet, if you take that to another country, why do we assume that those same people are going to speak for their populations and know what the population wants? So I actually think what comes out of something like this, and what comes out of the general project that UC Berkeley had was, in Rwanda and former Yugoslavia, is, go talk to the people. So Fong Pham, who was the person who she's an epidemiologist who worked with me on this project, we wanted to do a survey, and my colleague Harvey Weinstein and I, Harvey traveled with me one time when we were setting up the survey, so we needed somebody who really understood survey research, and we were asking about who in Rwanda was capable of organizing the kind of survey that we wanted to do. The people in the town we were living in, Butare, said, well, there's this Chinese woman who knows this kind of stuff. And so we ended up knocking on the door and found out that it was a Vietnamese American woman, Fong Pham, who was from Tulane School of Public Health and was working for a project there. And she'd never done this kind of work at all, but she knew how to do survey research, and so we brought her on. And now she's actually made a career of this. She's now at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, and she's actually specialized in going into post-conflict and conflict societies and doing survey research. So she's done a number of research projects in Eastern Congo. They've done a lot of work in Central African Republic. They've gone into Sierra Leone, and they went illegally into Myanmar. Before the changes there, and they've done survey research, basically. They've done research, and they've worked with Humanity United, which is a charity that's funded by Google money, to develop technology so you can use it PDA to get the answers to a survey, and they get uploaded to the cloud and then immediately disappear, so that you have no record, so that if you get stopped by the authorities, there's nothing to be traced back to the people. So they've been doing things. So the point is, there are people who are working on this thing. Even in the most chaotic situations, you can usually do research and you can usually find out what people want.
Yeah, and do you think, is that like becoming like the model for doing this kind of research
No.
in the field?
Oh, for doing the research, sure.
Yeah.
Is it influencing policy?
Yeah.
Not so much yet. Maybe it will. But if you look at how the ICC is operating, it doesn't seem to have learned a lot of the lessons. The one thing that the ICC has done differently is, so one of the things that came out of my research, that's come out in a lot of research in these places, is that for survivors, the most important thing is not finding the truth of what happened, but having their lives restored. And so reparations are actually the most important thing that survivors almost universally want. They actually, their livelihoods have been destroyed, they've lost their families, which are their support structures, so they're living in poverty, and what they really want is a decent life again. And so for the survivors in Rwanda to feel justice, the number one thing that would make them feel that is if they lived in security. And I don't mean physical security. I mean, I don't mean like security from being attacked, but food security. And so the one thing the ICC has done is it has created a survivors fund. So there was some acknowledgement that people who are directly affected by the violence, and there's two levels of it. One is sort of a general fund for societies where the court is working, where they can support development projects. The other is specific funds for people who are identified as victims of the particular cases that they're working on. The problem is, in any country they're doing 2 or 3 or 4 cases, and so the numbers of people who are helped that way is relatively small. One of my conclusions is I think bringing justice closer to people is better. The ICC does the opposite, right? Everything is in The Hague, and it's distant. It doesn't feel very connected to people's lives. One of my conclusions after all of this is, for trials in particular, the best thing they could do is to give good justice and not worry nearly as much about the social repercussions.
What do you mean by good justice? Reparations, is that what you mean?
No. I think reparations is a separate thing, but I mean in this case, holding people fairly accountable. So having comprehensive justice where you are holding people on all sides fairly accountable. I think in a case like Rwanda, the one thing that ICC does that I think is better is not trying to hold every single individual involved in the violence in any way accountable. Because I ultimately think we are better off if we target the people who organize the violence. Because I think if you teach presidents and generals and others that they will be held accountable for promoting this kind of violence, then they might think twice. Your average citizen who's a foot soldier doesn't usually feel like they have much choice. They do, and in some way we can hold them accountable, but I do think like in Rwanda, they probably would have been better. The model I would have used, sort of go back to the question earlier about what would be better, is the model I would have used is probably to have trials for a select number of the people who organize, so maybe 2 or 3 people in each community who were the chief organizers, and have some sort of truth commission process for everybody else. And then I would have focused more on reparations. So one of the things that was really sad was in Gacaca, as it was envisioned, the people who were found guilty were going to do community service in their own communities. Instead, they were sent to labor camps outside the capital to make the capital fancier for the people who weren't in Rwanda in 1994. You can't talk about ethnicity in Rwanda today, so when people go to Rwanda, I say, but you can ask people where they were in 1994. And what people who travel to Rwanda will find is in government office after church office after civil society group that they go to, one after another, the vast majority of people they talk to, particularly all the directors, all the people in good salaried positions, none of them were in Rwanda in 1994. Whether they're survivors or they're sort of Hutu masses, they're left out. And it's these people who are not in Rwanda who come back in and establish their control over the economy, control over the political system, and so So what I would have done, I think, is to have a smaller number of trials, a broader truth-telling process, and then more focus on addressing the needs of the survivors. But also I would have dealt with the people who were affected by the RPF's own policies. So there are a lot of people who say, well, we can't mourn our dead because our families were killed by the RPF, either when they came into Rwanda and took power, or when they came into Congo and they bombed the camps, or where they hunted people down in the rainforests.
I don't know if I can ask this correctly. You said a couple things I'm going to try to put together. Like you said at one point, you saw the violence was bubbling, and you said at another point there isn't. I don't know if they're related or not. But there isn't a way to kind of say, what do you believe in, what happened, what happened afterwards. There was no way to get empirical evidence.
No, there was. You could have gotten.
Right, but it wasn't.
But they didn't. They didn't.
They didn't.
Could've,
right.
But you could have.
But I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, as a student, this is sort of a long question. I think that, what are the alternative ways for students or lay people to engage with this material such that students can gain skills for and to become proactive, a proactive peacemaker managing both preventive and reconciliation actions? Do you see what I'm saying? It's like, I really appreciate and really impressed that you came in and you said, this is kind of dark, this is my dark writing. I was like, I was really glad to hear that self-reflective. How do we engage with the material so that we understand it, but find ways to intervene in the legal system to take it to a broader context?
There's sort of two sides. One is the prevention, right, which we do not focus on nearly enough. So after Rwanda and Yugoslavia, there was a major push in the 1990s for early warning systems, saying, let's look at what happened in these cases, Somalia as well, and thinking about, okay, how can we prevent these kinds of cases in the future? So initially there was early warning systems. Big international communities, out of the UN and a lot of things. It was particularly driven by some groups in Canada. And then some of those people involved in that got involved in pushing for the responsibility to protect R2P, which was then pushed in the Security Council. It was actually adopted as an official position in the Security Council. that when there is an imminent danger of mass death, that issues of sovereignty should be set aside, and there should be a right for the international community to intervene. So that is official policy of the United Nations. Didn't do anything about the vetoes in the United Nations, and so in fact, R2P has been invoked twice in Libya and in Cote d'Ivoire, and justified interventions in those two cases. R2P has almost entirely disappeared now. So the shift in the world, not just in the United States, it's not just Trump, but it's the rise of nationalism in Europe, the increasing nationalism in Russia and China, both states which have become more authoritarian in the past decade, under Putin and under Xi. So that is largely fallen away. But to me, that's really sad, because I think that was a very positive thing, was to say that when people are going to be slaughtered, all other political considerations need to go aside. Now, my pie in the sky solution would be that the veto in the Security Council should be eliminated for things like genocide. You know, when there is a sense that we need to intervene to save people's lives, the United States, China, Russia, France, and Britain should not be able to stop that. So reform's not going to happen, because that would mean us giving up power. But I think that's what should happen, right? And it's based on the idea of R2P. So I think that it should be much more focused on prevention. I've done a lot of consultancies for the State Department. I do quite a bit of work for the U.S. government on democracy and human rights promotion. I've done it in Congo a couple of times, Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, and elsewhere. Our policies are based much more on political realities and political considerations than they are on consistent application of human rights principles. And I really think we need to be, I really think if we want to prevent violence, we need to be very consistent. We need to not compromise on defending people's rights. And you know, for that, I believe in democracy everywhere. There are problems with it. We don't always like the results, but I actually think the end result is going to be more positive. You know, so we didn't like the way things happened in Egypt after they had democratic elections and the Muslim Brotherhood came into power. I don't think we're better off now having a brutal military dictatorship which suppresses them. You know, I think we were better with Democrats we didn't like very much than we are with dictators we do like. So I think one big thing is there's a lot more we can do for prevention. So it's not allowing things to get so bad that we have to intervene. Right? I think there's a lot of steps we can take. This is one of my frustrations is when I teach about these sorts of things in my human rights class is there's an assumption that either we send in the troops or we do nothing. And there are so many things we can do before that final blunt and largely ineffective tool of sending in the troops. In the Rwanda case, we didn't even call it genocide. You know, and one of the things that was most interesting in the research I did for Human Rights Watch is I went into a couple of very small rural communities and went through all of the minutes. I went through all of the archives they had from government offices, and in the minutes I found that minutes for their county council meetings, basically, that they were worried about what the world was thinking they were doing. They were saying, you know, the mayor said that people need to be really careful not to kill people in the open and leave their bodies out, because American satellites will see that and it will give us a bad reputation. You know, and the fact that it wasn't true, our satellites weren't looking for that, but the fact that they were worried about that tells you how much influence we could have had, right? And if we had spoken up early and concretely and condemned the violence, it actually could have had a big impact. So there's all sorts of diplomatic things that you can do, you know, boycotts of various sorts, and you know, there's a lot of things you can do before sending. So I think we should have much more focus on stopping conflict, because we're really bad at stopping conflict, because we don't worry about it. We worry more about our political considerations. We focused a lot on what happens after, right? Because we undervalue conflict prevention. We spend so much time now on all these things about reconciliation and transitional justice, which frankly we wouldn't need if we stopped the conflicts in the first place. But in terms of the sort of reconciliation and transitional justice, I think being skeptical and self-reflective and self-critical is essential. I think there is an arrogance of power that is dangerous. We in the West think we have the answers. We think we are civilized and other people are not. And therefore we tend to impose our solutions on other people in ways that I think are not helpful. I think maybe we're in recent years becoming more aware of our lack of a higher civilization that we thought we had. Maybe not. But at any rate, I think whatever solutions we come up with, we should be very critical of. I mean, I think there's a purpose for a dark book in that a lot of people think Rwanda is a really good example. So right now, this week, Canada has decided to throw its support behind the foreign minister of Rwanda, Louise Mushikiwabo, to become the head of the Francophonie, the organization for French-speaking people all over the world. This is a woman who has been in office for about 10 years, been a very big apologist for this regime. It's a woman who actually came up to my face and told me one time, "Tim, I don't like you." I said, "You mean you don't like what I say?" She said, "No, I don't like you." I said, "Because you seem to know a lot about Rwanda, but then you say these terrible things about my government, so I don't like you." You know, and you know, she's somebody who's basically supporting this kind of regime. Well, I think that we make a lot of compromises with dictatorship that we shouldn't. You know, and I think it is right to look critically. There is a very pessimistic view that can come out of some of this, which is to say, after horrible atrocities, there are limits to the positive change we can bring. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but I also think there is a place for being realistic. You're never going to bring the dead back, and anything that you do is going to be insufficient because of that. And I don't think we realize that. I think too often we have these ideas that let's use this tool, and this particular tool will make everything better. And therefore we end up becoming really disenchanted because they're not panaceas, because you can never restore a society that's been rendered so completely devastating. Right? So in South Africa, I actually think there's a lot to be said for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The general view on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission among scholars is very negative because it didn't bring reconciliation. You know, but my question is, well, did it move the ball forward? Did it, you know, what did it do? Well, it did establish, you can't deny that terrible things happened in South Africa, that apartheid was brutal after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It had failings. There are things we can learn from it. It didn't have enough of a systemic analysis. It focused too much on individual cases, and therefore didn't look at the way in which so many white people were beneficiaries of apartheid and were able to sort of wash their hands of it. So there's problems, but you know, my question is just, okay, you're never going to make things better, fully. You're never going to solve things, but you can make things better. You can move things forward. So I think it's figuring out the little steps that can move forward. The other thing is I don't think necessarily that big grand strategies are going to be the best thing. I think smaller scale, more modest things may make much more difference. For Rwanda, there are a lot of church groups that go there now. And there was a period when I used to get a lot of calls or emails from people who would say, "My church is going to Rwanda to bring reconciliation. What advice do you have?" You know, and my advice was generally, please don't. You know, this sort of naive, we're going to go in and solve all the problems. You know, I think small scale problems, to be frank, the answer to a lot of these things in a place like Rwanda is economic. You know, help address people's poverty. And they'll be less prone to being manipulated by leaders. If people have social security of some kind, they can resist authoritarian regimes more effectively. You know, so small scale projects where you bring people together, not for reconciliation, but around women's empowerment, let's say, or around child poverty, maternal health. There's all sorts of things you can do that don't seem like they're about reconciliation that actually will probably have a bigger impact. Because in the process, you know, what you do see in Rwanda is Hutu and Tutsi come together at the market. You know, they sell each other things, they have conversations there in these sort of public spaces, and probably that's much more effective reconciliation than through the formal reconciliation processes.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah?
So, my question is about forgiveness. first of all, I don't like that you shattered my understanding of Rwanda. I appreciate that you did, because I thought I knew something about Rwanda before I read your book. And I realized I didn't know anything about Rwanda. But one of the things I thought I knew, and that I still am not sure about now, is it seems there's this narrative that Tutsi survivors were almost universally able to forgive in ways that seems unimaginable to us. I know some people who have forgiven, and it's very inspiring stories.
Yeah.
We had a person in our class last week who had that story.
Yeah.
But after reading your book, I'm skeptical of that larger narrative on the whole, and I'm just wondering if you have any insights on that.
There's an extraordinary diversity of experience. So people reacted to first of all, people's experiences in the genocide were very different. Some were much more devastating than others. So some people, when the genocide was starting, were able to flee the country. And so, I know survivors who didn't really lose anyone in their family. I mean, one close friend who, his family lived right on the border with Burundi. They saw the violence was happening. They all fled, except they lost their grandfather. He was too old to move, and so he was the one person who was killed. But they didn't lose anybody. Their house was destroyed, but their experience is, that's a different experience from someone who was held as a sex slave for 3 months. But the difference in experience doesn't actually explain subsequent experience, because the person who was held as a sex slave may be the person who was actually most willing to forgive, and the person who didn't lose anything may still have a lot of bitterness in their heart. But so there are people who have never moved on from the genocide. So like if you go to the survivor villages, everybody in Rwanda, there's a certain way that you build your household. You build a compound. Your house is at the center of a compound. The new villages that Rwanda's been promoting don't really quite allow that, but what people at least do is they sort of build a hedge around their yard, or at the very least they sort of put some kind of border of flowers and other things. You can go to the survivor villages and you see some houses that don't have any flowers, that don't have anything planted, and you know that those are people who just have never moved on. There's people still who are just sort of catatonic, who can't. There are other people who have completely moved on. It's like, hell no, I'm not going to live in a survivor village with a bunch of people who are sitting around feeling sorry for themselves. I'm going to, my life is moving on, I'm going to go and get a job, and then, that is in the past, and that is behind me. And then I think the majority of people are somewhere in the middle where they need some confrontation for the past. They want to remember it, they want to, so there's a real diversity of experience. Gacaca itself had a very varied experience. There were communities where it worked pretty well, where there were confrontations, and some places it worked well at first, and then almost everywhere it kind of dissipated as time went on. There's a great series of films by a French filmmaker, Anna Guillon, one of which won an Emmy for Best Documentary. She did 3 films in succession looking at Gacaca in one community. And then she did a final film that was a summary of the other 3 films. So there's actually 4 films, but sort of 3 different periods where she went in just after they had released prisoners, when Gacaca was going on, and sort of as Gacaca was wrapping up. And she did not speak Kinyarwanda. She didn't use a translator. She just went in and would pose questions with a translator in Kinyarwanda, but she didn't have things translated back to her. So she didn't actually. So she just sort of sat there, and people she became a fly on the wall. And the ethics of the way she did it is a little bit questionable. But at any rate, people just sort of opened up. And so, in the first 2 films, you actually get a pretty positive sense of the reconciliation that's happening. There's a guy who's involved in killing something in the widows of the men, at least in one case a widow of a man he killed. They sort of had this confrontation in a bar, but it's a very Rwandan confrontation where they're kind of, she's sort of sitting there like talking like this while he's sitting back there, and it's not an argument, it's very, Rwandans don't say things directly, and so, but it's interesting, they sort of work things out, and he kind of half apologizes, and she kind of comes to some terms where they can live together. But then, and so Anne at that time, was talking about how, that in the next village over, Gacaca was a disaster, but in the village she was staying, it was going pretty well. But then in the 3rd film, it's not. In the 3rd film, first of all, you find out that these women who were survivors are actually all Hutu, that they were all Hutu widows of Tutsi men, and therefore they're not considered survivors. They don't get any of the survivor benefits. They don't. Their children were all Hutu because the husband is. The children are Tutsi. The children were Tutsi. Many of their children were killed, but they don't get any of the sort of, they don't get the credit of being survivors. But another thing, as you watch the gacaca that she shows, the gacaca session in the film, gacaca session in a way, you see these government officials intervening and correcting, and an outsider looking at it's not necessarily going to know, but it's somebody, I can tell this guy should not be speaking up. He's not supposed to be intervening in the way that he is, and that it ended up not being a particularly positive experience. But it varied, varied across time, and it varied from community to community, and it varies from survivor to survivor. And there are certainly stories of people who have reconciled, but do we know what percentage that is? Even in the story that I'm telling you, there were the one survivor judge who really was actively promoting reconciliation outside of the gacaca process, using gacaca. He seemed to have a lot of success there. He did. There were certainly cases where there were forgiveness. There are some church groups that have done some interesting work on gacaca. The Pentecostals in particular, the born-again movement that went through the prisons had a big impact. So a large portion of the people who confessed were people who'd had a born-again experience in prison. And part of their coming to terms with their sinning past was to admit their role in the genocide and come forward. The logic of that is pretty straightforward, in that you become a new person, you're reborn in Christ, and therefore you can leave all that behind you. That was, and therefore you can make a really honest request for forgiveness. And in those cases, I think a number of cases the survivors were able to forgive. The thing that did come out though is, part that surprised me in the 2015 interviews was the degree to which people were like, the truth did not set them free. Like finding out the details of what happened actually made it harder for them to reconcile. It's easier to reconcile when you have somebody who said, I was involved in your husband's death, I'm so sorry, I've now found Christ, and can you please forgive me? That's a pretty easy forgiveness. But when you have the gacaca hearing where you then have to tell the whole story, the details about how you hunted him down, and then you chopped him with a machete, and then somebody, that makes the reconciliation harder. Sort of abstract reconciliation is easier than forgiving, or abstract forgiveness is easier than the specific forgiveness. So it's varied. The big problem with the narrative about it is that it's a narrative that's driven largely by the Tutsi who control the government, who were not in Rwanda and did not lose family. So when the revolution happened in 1959, it targeted mostly the chiefs. And so the vast majority of people who left Rwanda initially were people from elite families, people with royal connections, like President Kagame. President Kagame is from the Queen Mother's clan. He is from royal blood. And a number of the people in his government are from royal blood. And the people who fled mostly were the elite Tutsi. Not entirely, but mostly. And mostly the Tutsi who stayed behind were the poor Tutsi. One of the dirty secrets in Rwanda is that those in power, for the most part, did not lose family members. The RPF, they could attack the country and protect the Tutsi, but if a bunch of Tutsi gets killed, well, it's the commoners. It's not the powerful, it's not the Tutsi, it's not my family. And so it's really easy for them to forgive. And so a lot of the narrative is the Tutsi government has been so generous to these Hutu. Well, it's easy for them to be generous because they didn't actually lose anything. And they ended up winning a whole country and getting rich, and then going to Congo and getting a whole bunch of wealth from there. And there's a neighborhood in Kigali called Merci Congo. Thank you Congo, because they were all these generals that were able to build mansions with the loot stolen from Congo. So yeah, it's easy to forgive when you were not yourself affected.
And when you're not in power. So, okay, thank you.
Personal question.
Yeah.
How did your experiences through all of this research and the visits and dealing with the people and knowing the people, how did this impact you?
I will say, if I were going in purely as a scholar, I think it would be much harder. But because, when I went back after the genocide, I was working for Human Rights Watch. And what that meant is I gathered all this information, I heard all these horrible stories, but then I also did something about it, right? So we wrote the sort of definitive book on the genocide leading up to tell the story, and like all human rights reports, it has recommendations, right? And when I've done human rights missions, when I've gone to Eastern Congo, when I've gone to Burundi, I come back and meet with people in the White House and in the United Nations and the Senate and the House of Representatives and the European Union, and we do a lot of lobbying and that sort of thing. So I think finding out terrible things and just writing a book about it probably wouldn't be very fulfilling, right? I think that would be hard to deal with. But having my one foot in the policy world means that I'm able to try to actually affect policy. And so, as I say, I do a lot of consultancy for the State Department. The other thing I've done actually is I've been an expert witness in about a dozen war crimes trials. So I do quite a bit of testifying. I've testified in cases in Finland and Canada and the United Kingdom and Sweden and the U.S. and elsewhere on people who were accused of genocide crimes. And so that's another. I think doing some proactive things helps psychologically. On my first book on the churches, I mean, I still go to church, so it is not. I think one of the things that's helpful is to not, even though I'm very critical of the Christian churches for their role in the genocide, I'm also aware that there were a lot of Rwandans within the Christian churches who were inspired by their faith to resist. And so it's sort of realizing that it's not like Christianity is bad and causes violence. It's saying it can't be bad, it can't cause violence. I think what helps me is the sense that it's like what I want to come into our foreign policy. It's not that there are bad people and good people. It's that there is potential for bad in everyone. There's potential for good in everyone. Right? And so we can't say that the new government in Rwanda is good because they stopped the genocide and they're promoting development and promoting healthcare, and therefore we should allow them to do anything. So we should say, these are the things that they're doing that are good, and then their violation of human rights, these are the things that they're doing that are bad. So I think that for me is the sort of perspective. My dad was a big Niebuhrite.
Big what?
Niebuhrite. He'd studied with H. Richard Niebuhr, read a lot of Reinhold Niebuhr, and always had a very sort of philosophical approach to things and expecting human failing and recognizing our fallibility. And I think that's always helped me is to realize, one of the things I realized is that Rwanda, it's not that Rwandans are fundamentally bad people, overcome by evil. It's that, they were in a context where the bad was encouraged. And I look at my own society and the hatred that is being fueled here, and I recognize it. And so for me, I think that's the part that I find more troubling than anything, is that looking at the United States today, I am deeply worried about the direction we're going. I think the degree to which we're scapegoating people is something I recognize. Anything else? Yeah. Let me.
Oh, you go ahead. No, just your last sentence. So what? Again, as students, what
I think it's very easy for you to address things here. I mean, for God's sake, what's the church doing? The number of evangelical leaders who are willing to speak up on behalf of, just yesterday there's something about, a pastor saying that a hurricane hit Florida because of the Democrats' resistance to Kavanaugh. Like, as Christians, we should not be allowing that. We should be speaking up. And I think the reluctance of progressive Christianity to find its voice and to speak is allowing, allows this. Helen Fine has a really fantastic study, 30 years old now, where she looked at rates of victimization of Jews in different territories under Nazi control. So she looks across the area controlled by the Nazis and looks at the percentage of Jews who were killed, and finds factors of, tries to understand, why is it in some places like Hungary, a much smaller percentage of Jews were ultimately killed. And Greece was divided into two areas. One part where a lot of, I can't remember whether it was Athens section or the other, where a high percentage of Jews were killed. But one they were and one they weren't. So you can't just say it's like Greek culture or something like this. And so she looks at the different factors, and one of the factors she finds is where religious leaders spoke up early and clearly in opposition to the marginalization of the Jews, rates of death in the Holocaust were lower.
It's
You know,
Helen Fine.
Helen Fine, F-E-I-N. She's a sociologist who did a lot of, she works mostly on the Holocaust. She actually has, I think, a book called The Sociology of the Holocaust. But this book is, I can't remember the title. But that's what I want from the church. I mean, I think anybody involved in the church should be calling the church to be speaking up loudly now. You know, when I had a speaker I had sponsored last week who's one of the main biographers and editors of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's work, and she's one who kind of wants to take a middle ground, neither making him a saint nor the sort of thing that's become popular in some things to say, well, he's actually not all that great in his argument. Her argument was that, in fact, throughout much of his career, he didn't really confront Christian anti-Semitism very effectively. And even the approach, the sort of Niemöller approach of the confessing church, first they came for them, well, if you're only worried about the Jews because it may ultimately come to you, that's selfish. That's not actually particularly progressive. And so the conversation we had was quite an interesting one about really how he learned over time. So that when he wrote from prison, he was actually much more self-reflective and much more self-critical about his earlier work and his failure to really confront some of his own limitations and the complicity of the churches. So I mean, I think it really is important for us as Christians to be speaking up. And I think most pastors are afraid to do that for obvious reasons because of the implications. The congregations often don't like that. But at some level, I think it's incumbent upon us. If we want to save Christianity from extinction, unless we speak up, it ain't gonna. I'm teaching a course now, a 300-level course on religion and politics, a new course I've just introduced, and it's so mostly sophomores and juniors in the class, a few seniors, and it is amazing how few of them actually have any use for a religion. Almost all of them were raised in religious households, and almost all of them have fallen away, which is normal within the life cycle of young people. It's part of development, but what research is finding is that fewer and fewer people are coming back to the church. And when I had the students reflect in their journal sort of on their religious backgrounds, and for an awful lot of them, they're really disenchanted with religion. Part of it is the scandals within the Catholic Church over sexual abuse. Part of it is Christian support for Trump that is so outspoken, and you look at these young people, and they will be hard to win back to religion unless we take control of our religion again. I say this as a political scientist talking to a bunch of future pastors.
Actually, I'm really interested in the process of the economic development in Rwanda after genocide. So you say in your book, President Kagame regards Singapore as a model, believing that if we can bring prosperity to the population, they will not care about civil and political life then. So actually, that sentence reminds of us is like our country situation. So our country after some crisis, and then our old president, he wanna develop our country one better way. It makes a lot of problems, kind of human labor rights. So if one government or some people want to develop their economic situation, sometimes they are forced labor to work hard or to do more in order to achieve their economic development. So are there any problem in terms of human labor?
I mean, so there's a pretty old view that unless you're economically developed, you can't support democracy. right? There's an idea that if you don't have an active middle class, you can't have a strong civil society, you can't support. So Barrington Moore has a school where he compares different dictatorships and democracy and why they developed. He doesn't really look at the developing world. Evidence really doesn't support that, right? What's the largest democracy in the world? India, right? It has a lot of poverty, it's chaotic, but its democracy kind of works. It's got problems just like ours does. You know, and we look at others, you know, there's no evidence that dictatorships perform economically better than democracies. As a matter of fact, evidence suggests the contrary. No. I mean, there are individual cases, sure, you can say like Singapore, it worked, right? But that doesn't mean you can replicate that anywhere else. And so we look at the Asian financial crisis, for example. You know, what led to Thailand's collapse? Well, frankly, the fact that you had enough a government that was too authoritarian, that didn't have accountability mechanisms, meant that corruption was wild, and you know, Thailand probably would have been better able to survive the financial collapse if it had had more democracy, right? There are arguments you can make in all directions. Well, it's pretty inconclusive. The issue we talk about sometimes is sequencing. Which do you need first? Economic development or democracy? And there's some people that say, well, you need democracy first, because only in a democratic system can you really develop in an equitable fashion that will be positive for the whole population. There are others who argue that you need economic development first because you can only sustain democracy in a good economy. And I think a lot of us come down somewhere in the middle and say that they really need to happen together, right? That you need to democratize while you're also trying to develop your economy. There are people who can see nothing good in the Rwandan Patriotic Front. But I'm not one of those. I actually think they've done a pretty good job of managing the economy. The government's made a couple of smart decisions. The president has realized that if you limit corruption, when foreign donors give you money and you actually use it for what they want you to use it for, and it produces results, they may give you more money, right? And so Rwanda gets a lot of foreign aid now. It's tons and tons of foreign aid. Its government, its budget is heavily dependent upon foreign assistance, and it has all these projects that are coming in. Well, it's because they've managed corruption really well. They're efficient, they're effective. That's good. There's nothing about that says you can't be democratic as well. You know, you could fight corruption and be democratic. Right? You could fight corruption, you know, and allow people to vote freely and speak out. As a matter of fact, if people could speak freely, they'd probably be better able to point out the corruption that exists. You know, in a democratic system where you actually had a functioning system of, you can build into a democracy a system that controls corruption, right? So they've made a choice that in order to have economic development, they need to suppress democracy. But that's not based on, again, it's not based on empirical evidence. There's no evidence that keeping people down lets them develop more. As a matter of fact, if anything, it seems like it might do the opposite, because it suppresses ideas, it suppresses opportunity, and it also means that those in power are able to, you know, protect their interests. Just that's not a free market. So I think we should stop there too. Any other questions? I think you all are supposed to work on your projects or something. That's what I was told. So let's stop at 1:45 or 2, and we're already past 2. So anything else? Any other questions? Yeah?
The name of the woman at Harvard doing the survey.
Fong Fan. If you look in, she's in.
Oh, she's in great. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
She's a co-author of things, and we did an article similar to this that she's the lead author on in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Fong Fan, PhD.
So should we say thank you and just?
Yeah.
It's nice to have people read your book, so it's my pleasure.
It's a hard book to read.
It's not badly written, is it?
No.
It's just not very happy. My mom said it was very depressing when she read it.
It's just sort of hard to figure out how to hold it, you know, and kind of how to hold the information depending on what, you know, why are you coming to the class and stuff.
I mean, it's political science, right? So it's, you know, it's not necessarily directly. It's not. I'm not writing for pastors, let me say, or theological, but hopefully it resonates in some ways. So.
And also, what do pastors do with political science? Right? That's a big question.
We would urge you to use empirical examination of things.
I would urge you to change the paradigm. I would urge you to change the empirical paradigm.
Well, I'm not the kind of political who just does like
yeah,
that.
I love
I'm pretty qualitative in my work anyway. Anyway, thank you all.
Thank you.